itself was a singularity, that is to say, an incomparable, irreducible, non-exchangeable form. Then emerged the universality of culture, then the current globalization of a culture that had become a global product. I would like to talk a little more about this fate of culture in which each of us encounters, within a global context, the problem of cultural identity. I remember a highly symbolic conference on European identity held a few years ago in Venice, highly symbolic in such a prestigious city that is both ceaselessly disappearing and being ceaselessly restored. Jorge Luis Borges, who was involved, summed up the situation revealingly by saying that he was in fact the only true European present in that gathering. He was indeed the only one, together with the representatives of some Eastern European countries, to dream positively of Europe, to keep a lively imagination of Europe, to cultivate the idea of Europe, that is, an idea of the universal, of culture, and not merely the idea of a defensive organization desperately seeking its identity. America, for its part, has no real concern for its own identity. It is a product of the simultaneous performance of contradictory forces. America is all about excess, while Europe occurs by default. The problem with this virtual Europe, with this artificial construction that is often built against public opinions and peoples, is without a doubt the difficulty it encounters in extending its history within the global power game. Europe endeavors, politically no doubt, and economically with the euro, to create an original entity, a kind of European exception on the model of the French cultural exception, in any case a counterweight to globalization, the globalization that in our imagination we associate with the United States. However, on the one hand, even as a unified concept, Europe is only ever a staging post, a byproduct, a branch office of this globalization, while on the other hand, due to the very fact that it is everywhere and that it permeates in terms of culture, economics, mores, and technology, every country, every continent, every individual, America is not the real site of globalization. The entire world is the site of globalization, and the entire world is the site of resistance to globalization. In other words, and however much we may resist it, America is in each and every one of us, and we are all in some way Americans. At the same time, America is really nothing more than an all-powerful idea, a concept against which the rest of the world has nothing to oppose but its real existence. Beyond its economic, political, and strategic power, for over a century or more, America has become our primal scene, the primal scene of modernity, which should not be confused with its origin. Although the historical origin of modernity is in Europe, nowadays, for all of us globally, modernity's mythological, trans-historical, and almost unconscious point of reference is America. America is the catalyst or the strange attractor of all modernity, the dynamic principle of a planetary new frontier, of a globalization of which no one can say where it is leading us. If a culprit is to be found, it can only be America. And even if Europe, or later the rest of the world, follows suit and adopts the same model, it will do it as part of a relationship increasingly characterized with ambiguity and rivalry. For strange attractors elicit counter-motivations that are every bit as strange. Globalization itself is an ambiguous concept. It is not really a concept at all. It is a state of affairs, an apparently irresistible one, but also one that, precisely because no one has a monopoly on it, runs the risk of happening at everyone's expense. What globalization produces first and foremost is an increasing global discrimination, that is to say, in each country, including America, a larger and larger mass of excluded people that may one day reach its critical level. There are, as the expression goes, those who find themselves on the right side and those fallen on the wrong side of the universal. The absolute assumption of any model unavoidably creates insoluble contradictions. For the enemy no longer comes from the outside, it comes from the inside, from the absolute success of a model. Besides, it is not at all certain that modernity itself would have been fundamentally accepted as the outcome of some universal evolutionism and as an indisputable utopia. The idea of modernity is universally accepted, but not the fact. Europe remains the scene, the historical platform of a conflict between modernity and challenge to modernity, also evident in the contradictory play of the signs of modernity. Or rather, one gets the impression that modernity and counter-modernity clash and ride over each other like the tectonic plates that behavior patterns, whether they be traditional, religious, linguistic, nationalistic, or individual, irrational and archaic, exist side by side with the automatic reflex behaviors of modernity, or that these behaviors are simply layered over the others without changing them in any way. No doubt, even reactionary behaviors become strengthened as a result of the very movement of modernity, instead of being absorbed by it. If this is so, it is a conflict for which there is no solution. In Europe, at least, the suspense and the ambiguity remain total. In any case, culture itself, as a universal form, is a figure of exile and of transcendence. The aesthetic and critical charm of European culture used to come from this virtual quality, at least in the modern period, from the exile, real or figured, of the great creators and the great works vis-à-vis their own societies. Culture does not translate the identity of a society, the immanence of a system of values. On the contrary, culture is their transcendence, disavowal, challenge, and distance. The pathos of distance, as Nietzsche put it himself. Nietzsche, who declared himself the first great European, and who, from the depths of exile, always spoke of Europe. This is why, whatever one may do, culture remains irreducible and ungraspable. At the heart of the universal, this is what remains of its very singularity. This is why all ministries of culture are a joke. Nothing can be done for culture. Either a society is capable of this act of brilliance, of this brilliant singularity, of this prestigious one, and in the event does not need to ask itself questions about its own culture. It simply is, that is all. Let's leave aside here so-called primitive cultures, anthropological cultures. The same is true for communication. If and when communication happens, the question of communication is not even put. There is no word for it. Or else a society unable to create this spark of culture, and then its cultural identity becomes an issue. And at that point, all is lost, for society can never identify itself, will never verify its reality in its culture. At best, such a society can blot out, expense itself, lose itself in its culture, practice the art of its own disappearance in its most beautiful or most radical forms. To put it simply, this is its accursed share. Culture is a luxury. If not a luxury, it is nothing. No society ever waited until everyone had enough to eat to play with words and signs. If culture must align itself with needs or with problems of underdevelopment, if it is to become the ration of the messages and information to which every individual is entitled, that he, she will be compelled to absorb or else become a social outcast, if it must be produced and promoted at all levels as communication, pure and simple, then one can be assured that culture has lost all meanings. Let's be assured, too, that this is not a nostalgic and elitist recrimination. Neither luxury nor culture have any longer meaning when the supreme goal has become the economic and functional management of existence. Culture loses all meaning when it is defined by cultural identity, that is, by a pure and simple statement of existence, when it becomes nothing more than a signature. Culture is a form of glory. It implies the notion of sovereignty. Identity is a poor value. There is always something vain and useless about identity claims.